Why loners are magnets for toxic people. Carl Jung once famously said, "Loneliness does not come from having no people about one, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to oneself." It is a profound paradox. Why is it that those who seek peace and solitude often end up surrounded by chaos and manipulation? If you identify as a loner or a deep thinker, you may have noticed a pattern where your empathy becomes a beacon for those who wish to drain your energy. Is this simply bad luck? Or is there a deeper psychological force at play, perhaps a dance between your light and their shadow? Welcome back to Spiritual Wisdom. Today, we are applying the profound teachings of Carl Jung to uncover why this magnetic attraction exists, and more importantly, how you can reclaim your boundaries. Before we dive in, I have a question for you. Have you ever felt that your silence was misinterpreted as weakness by a toxic person? Share your experiences in the comments below. Let's support each other as we unravel this mystery. 1. No social army. The lone target. Have you ever found yourself wondering why, in your pursuit of peace and solitude, you seem to inadvertently attract the most chaotic and manipulative individuals into your life? It is a paradox that often baffles those who walk the path of introspection. But the answer lies deep within the dynamics of human psychology and the energy we project. When you commit yourself to a journey of true spirituality, you naturally begin to detach from the superficial noise of the crowd, seeking a deeper connection with the self and the universe. However, this sacred withdrawal often creates a vacuum that predatory personalities are all too eager to fill. The specific vulnerability lies in the absence of what we might call a social army, a concept that is crucial to understanding why you may have become a target. In the ordinary world, the average person moves through life surrounded by a protective buffer, a network of friends, family members, co-workers, and acquaintances who act as a defensive perimeter. This social circle functions not just for companionship, but as a system of checks and balances, a collection of objective observers who validate reality. When a person with a strong social army begins to date or befriend a toxic individual, there are witnesses watching. If the toxic person attempts to manipulate, lie, or mistreat their target, there is a chorus of voices ready to step in and say, "That is not right," or "You deserve better." These witnesses act as a safety net, spotting the red flags that the victim might miss because of emotional attachment. However, for the loner, particularly one who is undergoing a profound spiritual awakening, this safety net is often non-existent or intentionally dismantled. You may have distanced yourself from former associates to align better with your higher purpose, or perhaps you simply find solace in the quiet of your own company. While this solitude is a source of strength and wisdom, toxic people view it through a completely different lens. To them, your isolation is not a sign of independence, but an invitation. They perceive the loner as a high-value target specifically because there are no witnesses to their behavior. They understand that in your world, there is no one around to warn you, no one to point out the inconsistencies in their stories, and no one to validate your feelings when they begin the subtle process of gaslighting. Without a social army to act as a mirror reflecting the truth back to you, the toxic person knows they can distort your reality with frightening ease. They realize that if they manage to hurt you, confuse you, or drain your energy, there will be no cavalry coming over the hill to rescue you. It is just you and them. This dynamic essentially transforms the spiritual seeker into what can be metaphorically described as a lone gazelle. In the wild, a predator rarely attacks the herd directly because the collective eyes and ears of the group make success difficult and dangerous. Instead, they scan the horizon for the one creature that has wandered away from the safety of the pack. The toxic person operates on this exact same primal instinct. They are looking for the path of least resistance, and the loner represents a scenario where they can exert total control without the interference of third-party judgments. They know that without friends to act as a sounding board, you are more likely to internalize their toxicity, blaming yourself for the chaos they bring rather than seeing it for what it objectively is. This is not to say that your solitude is a flaw in fact. It is a necessary component of your growth and spirituality, but it is vital to recognize that this very independence signals to the toxic mind that you are unprotected. They see your lack of a witness as a tactical advantage, allowing them to isolate you further and accelerate their manipulation tactics without fear of exposure. Therefore, understanding that you are being viewed as a lone gazelle is not about fear, but about awareness. It is about realizing that your lack of a social army requires you to be doubly vigilant, trusting your own intuition as your primary defender as you navigate the complexities of human connection. 2. The challenge of independence. When you walk through this life content in your own company, you inevitably emit a frequency of strength that is rare in this noisy world. And this self-sufficiency often becomes a beacon for those who are drowning in their own insecurities. You see, true loners do not seek external validation or attention because they have found a home within themselves. However, toxic people observe this quiet confidence not with admiration, but as a direct challenge to their fragile egos. To a narcissist or an energy vampire, your independence is an affront because it proves that a person can survive and thrive without their influence. And this terrifying reality drives them to view you as a mountain they simply must conquer. They do not want to be your friend or your partner in the traditional sense. Rather, they want to be the one person, the single source upon whom you eventually become dependent. It is a twisted game of power where they perceive your boundaries as walls to be breached and your silence as a code to be broken. They are drawn to you because breaking a strong, independent person gives the toxic person a massive ego boost, a temporary high that validates their false sense of superiority. When you are focused on your spirituality and spiritual development, you naturally detach from the drama and the chaotic games that others play. But paradoxically, this detachment makes you even more attractive to those who thrive on chaos. They look at you and see a puzzle. They wonder why their usual tricks of manipulation and flattery do not work on you. And this curiosity quickly morphs into an obsession to dismantle the very foundation of your self-worth. They believe that if they can make a self-sufficient person like you crave their approval, then they must truly be special, powerful, and important. It is important to understand that their pursuit is not about affection, but about colonization. They want to occupy your mind and control your emotions because your autonomy reminds them of their own inner emptiness. As you deepen your spiritual development, you will realize that these encounters are not random bad luck, but are actually tests of your resolve and clarity. These individuals are trying to drag you back down into the transactional world, where relationships are based on debt and dependency, whereas you are striving for a world of freedom and authentic connection. The toxic person sees your light that clear, steady flame of someone who knows who they are, and they feel an uncontrollable urge to blow it out, or, at the very least, to make it flicker so they can say they controlled the wind. They will probe your armor, looking for the slightest crack, perhaps a hidden insecurity or a momentary lapse in judgment, and they will hammer at that weak point, relentlessly hoping to create a dependency where none existed before. They want to be the architect of your reality, the gatekeeper to your happiness, and the sole provider of your emotional needs. When you refuse to play this game, when you stand firm in your sovereignty, you inadvertently trigger their deepest wounds of rejection and worthlessness, causing them to double down on their efforts to win you over or destroy your peace. This dynamic explains why you, as someone who asks for nothing, often find yourself besieged by those who demand everything. It is because your very existence proves that their worldview, one where everyone is a puppet to be manipulated, is false. Your spiritual path is one of liberation, and to the jailer, the free soul is the ultimate threat. Therefore, you must recognize that this challenge they perceive is actually a projection of their own internal war, and by seeing it clearly, you can step aside and let them fight their shadows alone while you continue your ascent. Has your solitude ever been misunderstood by others? If so, share your story below so others know they aren't alone. If you are ready to embrace your power, comment, "I am strong," and join our community of awakened souls. 3. The trap of being a good listener. Have you ever found yourself sitting across from someone, feeling the heavy weight of their words piling up on your shoulders, while you sit there in silence, unable to find a polite exit? It is a scenario that many of us who identify as loners know all too well, and it stems from a trait that is usually celebrated as a virtue: the ability to truly listen. However, there is a hidden danger lurking within this quiet strength, a specific dynamic that explains why your calm demeanor often attracts the most chaotic storms. As we dive into this analysis, drawing upon deep spiritual wisdom, we must recognize that your comfort with silence is exactly what makes you a beacon for those who cannot stand the quiet of their own minds. To a loner, silence is a sanctuary, a place of restoration and peace. But to a toxic person, your silence is not a boundary. It is an empty stage, an invitation for them to step up and perform their endless monologues. When you offer your silence to a toxic individual, they do not see it as an opportunity for mutual reflection. They see it as a void that they are entitled to fill with their complaints, their dramas, and their negativity. This is where the trap of being a good listener snaps shut. You become a magnet for what psychologists often call emotional dumping. Unlike a healthy conversation, which operates like a game of tennis with a back-and-forth exchange of energy and ideas, emotional dumping is entirely one-sided. You are no longer a participant in a dialogue. You have been unknowingly recruited as an unpaid therapist. The toxic person uses your patience to offload their psychological garbage, leaving them feeling lighter and relieved, while you walk away feeling heavy, drained, and psychologically exhausted. As the great Carl Jung once profoundly stated, the encounter with oneself is, at first, the meeting with one's own shadow. Toxic people run from their own shadows, and they use you, the quiet observer, as a place to project that darkness so they do not have to face it themselves. It is crucial to understand that this dynamic is not accidental. Toxic individuals often lack the emotional maturity to process their own feelings, so they seek out containers of people who will hold that emotional volatility for them. Because you, as a loner, possess a deep capacity for introspection and empathy, you naturally signal that you can handle depth. However, these individuals abuse that capacity. They exploit your polite nature and your reluctance to interrupt. They mistake your silence for agreement and your patience for permission. You might find yourself listening to the same stories, the same grievances, and the same victim narratives for hours on end, without ever being asked how you are doing or what you are thinking. This imbalance is the hallmark of a parasitic relationship, where one person feeds off the energy of the other. This brings us to a vital piece of spiritual wisdom. Compassion without boundaries is self-destruction. By allowing yourself to be the eternal receptacle for someone else's negativity, you are not helping them. You are enabling their lack of self-awareness while depleting your own spirit. Carl Jung reminded us that everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. If you feel irritation or exhaustion after these interactions, it is your psyche trying to tell you that a boundary has been violated. You are not obligated to be the dumping ground for another person's unresolved trauma. True wisdom lies in recognizing that your energy is a finite resource, sacred and worthy of protection. You must realize that being a good listener does not require you to surrender your voice. Realizing this is the first step toward breaking the cycle. You have to ask yourself why you feel compelled to endure these one-sided conversations. Is it a fear of being rude? Is it a need to feel useful? When you stop acting as the passive audience for their drama, you will find that these toxic magnets lose their power over you. You deserve relationships that are reciprocal, where your silence is respected as a part of your presence, not used as a tool for someone else's relief. By reclaiming your space and guarding your peace, you transform from a passive vessel into an empowered individual, grounded in the knowledge that your peace is too valuable to be traded for someone else's noise. 4. Patience is misread as permission. Have you ever wondered why, in your pursuit of solitude and peace, you seem to paradoxically attract the most chaotic and draining individuals? It is a baffling contradiction that many introspection seekers face. You retreat from the world to find harmony, yet the world brings its noise directly to your doorstep. This phenomenon is not a cosmic punishment, nor is it a coincidence. To understand this, we must look deeply into the psychological dynamics at play, particularly through the lens of spirituality and the insights of depth psychology. The answer lies in a fundamental misunderstanding of your nature. You see, there is a specific trait you possess, a quiet, observing stillness that you view as a virtue, but the toxic mind views as an invitation. We must explore why your greatest strength, your patience, is being weaponized against you. The root of this dynamic begins with how you, as a loner or a person undergoing a spiritual awakening process the world around you. You operate from a place of deep observation and profound empathy. When someone acts out, makes a mistake, or behaves poorly, your first instinct is not to judge or retaliate. Instead, you pause. You give them the benefit of the doubt. You look for the context, the hidden pain, or the shadow behind their actions, much as Carl Jung might suggest we look at our own shadows. You possess a high threshold for understanding because you are intimately acquainted with the complexities of the human soul. You wait to see if they will correct themselves, believing that everyone possesses the same capacity for self-reflection that you do. This silence is not emptiness. It is a full, vibrant space of patience and hope. You are holding space for them to be better, offering them a silent grace period to align with their higher selves. However, this noble trait holds a dangerous dark side when it meets the wrong frequency. While you are offering patience, the toxic individual is perceiving permission. It is crucial to understand that toxic personalities, narcissists, manipulators, and energy vampires do not speak the language of empathy. They speak the language of dominance and submission. When they act out and meet your silence, they do not see a wise soul contemplating the situation. They see a lack of defenses. They mistake your kindness for weakness and your silence for acceptance. In their eyes, if you do not immediately slam the door must be open. They interpret your benefit of the doubt as a green light to proceed with their behavior, unaware that you are merely observing them from a place of spiritual detachment. As this dynamic continues, the situation inevitably escalates because the toxic person will naturally seek to find where the actual boundary lies. Because you did not react to the first transgression, they feel emboldened to push further. It is like a tide slowly encroaching on the shore. With every wave that isn't pushed back, the water claims more land. They test your limits, not out of curiosity, but out of a compulsion to see how much they can take from you. They begin to encroach upon your mental and emotional sanctuary, assuming that your lack of outward resistance means you are compliant with their control. They cannot conceive that someone would voluntarily choose patience over conflict, so they assume you are simply incapable of fighting back. This is where the trap snaps shut. You are waiting for them to change, and they are waiting for you to stop them. Ultimately, this painful cycle is a harsh but necessary lesson on your path of spirituality. The realization you must come to is that your patience is a gift that must be earned, not a free commodity for those who wish to exploit it. In the process of your spiritual awakening, you are learning that protecting your peace is just as holy as being kind. The toxic person is drawn to you because your light is bright and your walls appear low, but they serve as a catalyst for you to build the necessary gates to your soul. You must learn that silence is not always the answer, and that sometimes the most spiritual thing you can do is to articulate a firm no. By understanding that your patience is being misread as permission, you can begin to close the gap between your intent and their perception, ensuring that your solitude remains a sanctuary, not a hunting ground for those who refuse to heal themselves. Like, subscribe, and ring the bell to stay updated on your journey of self-discovery. Don't let toxic energy drain you any longer. Claim your self-worth now by typing, I respect myself enough to say no. 5. The mirror effect. You may often find yourself bewildered by a cruel paradox. You are someone who seeks solitude, prefers the quiet company of your own thoughts, and deliberately avoids drama. Yet you frequently find yourself the primary target for toxic individuals. It seems counterintuitive that a person who asks for nothing more than peace would become a magnet for those who thrive on conflict. But the answer lies deep within the psychological phenomenon known as the mirror effect. When you stand firm in your solitude, you are not merely existing in a vacuum. You are radiating a frequency of stability and self-sufficiency that is blindingly painful for a toxic person to witness. Your ability to be alone without feeling lonely is a superpower. But to a person who is empty inside, that superpower looks like a threat. You possess a wholeness that they are desperately chasing but cannot find, and your very presence forces them to confront the void within themselves. This dynamic is rooted in the stark contrast between your internal world and theirs. You have cultivated a garden of peace, while they are living in a perpetual state of internal chaos and insecurity. When a toxic person looks at you, they do not see you as an individual. They see a mirror that reflects everything they are running from. Your silence is not empty. It is a clear, polished surface that reflects their unhealed wounds, their lack of identity, and their dependence on external validation. Carl Jung often spoke of the shadow self, the parts of us we refuse to acknowledge. And for the toxic individual, you become a living projection of the stability they lack. They cannot sit with themselves because they are terrified of what they might find in the silence. So when they see you sitting comfortably in your own silence, it triggers a deep-seated envy and resentment. They are insulted by your independence because it highlights their own desperate need for attention and control. Because this reflection is so painful for them, their defense mechanism kicks in, and they feel a compulsive need to lower your vibration to match theirs. They cannot rise to your level of spiritual development, so they attempt to drag you down to their level of dysfunction. This is where the subtle and insidious process of chipping away begins. To regain a false sense of power, the toxic person will try to dismantle your confidence piece by piece. They might make backhanded compliments, question your quietness as if it were a flaw, or try to interpret your boundaries as arrogance. Their goal is to create a crack in your self-esteem, a small opening through which they can inject their poison. If they can make you doubt yourself, if they can make you react with anger or sadness, they have successfully shattered the mirror. They have proven to themselves that you are just as chaotic and unstable as they are, which temporarily soothes their insecurity. However, understanding this mechanism is the key to your liberation and continued spirituality. You must realize that their attacks are not a commentary on your worth, but a confession of their own pain. When they try to provoke you, they are essentially begging for you to help them regulate their own turbulent emotions. By remaining the observer, a core practice in your spiritual development, you refuse to accept the invitation to their chaos. You are not being targeted because you are weak. You are being targeted because you are strong in a way they cannot comprehend. Your stability is a lighthouse, and while it may attract ships that are lost in the storm and looking to crash, it is your duty to remain the immovable rock. The moment you understand that their toxicity is a reaction to your light, you stop taking it personally, and the mirror remains unbreakable. 6. The empath trap. Have you ever wondered why, as someone who cherishes solitude and peace, you seem to constantly attract the most chaotic and draining individuals into your life? It is a paradox that frustrates many, but the answer lies deep within your own nature. You see, the very trait that makes you a profound thinker and a gentle soul, your empathy, is exactly what acts as a beacon for those who are emotionally destructive. In the realm of spiritual wisdom, we often talk about energy, and as a loner, you likely possess a high vibrational sensitivity that toxic people crave. You are not merely a person to them. You are a battery, a source of fuel. When you encounter a toxic person acting out, your instinct is rarely to run away or judge them harshly. Instead, because of your depth, you try to look beneath the surface. You see their pain, their trauma, and their unhealed wounds. As the great Carl Jung once said, one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. You are naturally inclined to look into that darkness, hoping to bring light to it. You try to understand them, and more dangerously, you try to fix them. You believe that if you just listen long enough, or love them hard enough, you can heal their brokenness. However, this is exactly where the trap snaps shut. This desire to be a savior, to be the one person who finally gets them, is what the toxic person exploits with surgical precision. They sense that you are different from the crowd. They sense that you will not reject them immediately like others might. They use your compassion against you, spinning tales of victimhood to keep you tethered to them. You might find yourself thinking, if I leave now, I am abandoning them just like everyone else did, and that guilt keeps you paralyzed in a cycle of abuse. It is vital to understand that this is not a relationship of equals. It is a parasitic dynamic. Carl Jung also famously noted that the meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. But in this specific toxic equation, you are the only one being transformed, and usually it is for the worse. You are being drained of your vitality while they remain exactly the same, feeding off your desire to help. Furthermore, we must analyze why you stay. Often, the loner stays because they project their own goodness onto the toxic person. You assume that deep down, they have the same conscience and heart that you do. This is a dangerous spiritual error. True spiritual wisdom requires discernment, not just blind compassion. By trying to fix someone who does not want to change, you are essentially interfering with their own karmic path. You are taking on burdens that do not belong to you. The toxic individual knows that you value deep connection, so they will often mirror your depth in the beginning, making you feel as though you have found a soulmate, only to slowly reveal their true nature once you are emotionally invested. They weaponize your empathy, turning your ability to understand into a weakness. As the author Maya Angelou wisely cautioned, when someone shows you who they are, believe them the first time. Yet, the empathetic loner often ignores the first, second, and third red flag, making excuses for the behavior in the name of understanding. You must realize that you cannot love someone into health if they are committed to their own toxicity. Your solitude should be a sanctuary, not a waiting room for broken people to come and consume your energy. Realizing this is not about becoming cold or uncaring. It is about establishing the boundaries necessary for your own survival. You must learn to distinguish between those who need support and those who need a host. Carl Jung taught us about the shadow, the hidden, darker side of the human psyche. When you refuse to see the dark potential in others because you are too busy being empathetic, you are ignoring the reality of the shadow. To break this cycle, you must accept that some people are not looking for a healer. They are looking for a victim. By stepping back and reclaiming your energy, you are not failing them. You are saving yourself. You are honoring the spiritual wisdom that dictates you must first be whole within yourself before you can truly offer anything of value to the world. It is time to close the door to those who only know how to take and open it only to those who know how to share. 7. Conflict avoidance. It is a profound irony of the human experience that those who seek silence the most are often the ones who attract the loudest chaos. And this paradox lies at the heart of why the solitary soul becomes a magnet for toxic energy. You might find yourself wondering why, despite your genuine intention to live a life of tranquility and minimal interference, you seem to constantly find yourself in the crosshairs of manipulative personalities. To understand this, we must look deeply into the nature of conflict avoidance, not as a weakness, but as a trait that, when viewed through the lens of spirituality, can be dangerously misinterpreted by those who lack your depth. For the true loner, peace is not merely a preference. It is a vital necessity, a sanctuary where the mind can expand and the soul can breathe. Consequently, you naturally detest drama and the shallow noise of unnecessary confrontation. When a minor disrespect or a subtle slight comes your way, your instinct is not to engage in a battle of egos, but to let it slide, believing that preserving your inner harmony is worth far more than winning a trivial argument. You choose the high road, assuming that silence is the most dignified response to foolishness. However, this very stillness, which is a sign of your maturity, is perceived entirely differently by the predatory nature of a toxic individual. Where you see a choice for peace, they see an open door. Where you feel you are being the bigger person, they perceive a lack of boundaries. It is crucial to understand that toxic people operate on a primitive frequency where dominance is the only language they speak fluently. When they test the waters with a small insult or a boundary violation, and you do not immediately push back with fire and fury, they do not interpret your silence as wisdom. Instead, they view your conflict avoidance as a green light, a tacit permission slip that signals it is safe for them to proceed with worse behaviors. They realize that the loner, in their quest for serenity, will tolerate a certain level of discomfort to avoid a fight. And like a thief finding an unlocked window, they decide to enter your life and dismantle your piece by piece. This dynamic becomes a perilous trap because the escalation is often subtle at first, masked by your own patience and capacity for forgiveness. You might tell yourself that it is part of your spiritual awakening to be tolerant, to see the good in others, and to rise above the fray. Yet, Carl Jung warned us that we must integrate our shadow that capacity for aggression and self-defense. Otherwise, we become victims of our own virtues. By consistently avoiding conflict to maintain a superficial peace, You inadvertently feed the ego of the toxic person, confirming their belief that you are a safe target who will absorb their negativity without consequence. They are drawn to you not just because you are quiet, but because your silence feels like a void they can fill with their own chaotic narratives. The toxic person realizes that because you are self-contained and perhaps isolated by choice, there is no one else around to witness their manipulation or come to your defense, making you the perfect vessel for their emotional projection. Ultimately, the lesson here is not that you must abandon your love for peace, but that you must learn to distinguish between peacefulness and passivity. A true spiritual awakening involves realizing that your energy is sacred and that protecting it sometimes requires the uncomfortable act of confrontation. The toxic person acts as a harsh mirror, reflecting the parts of yourself that are afraid to take up space or assert authority. When you understand that your conflict avoidance is the very magnet drawing them in, you can begin to shift your frequency. You learn that saying no and drawing a hard line in the sand is not an act of war, but an act of supreme self-love. By extinguishing that green light and showing that while you prefer peace, you are fully capable of defending your sanctuary, you break the cycle. You stop being a magnet for those who wish to use you and start becoming a magnet for those who respect the sacred silence you carry within. To affirm your readiness to speak your truth, even when it's difficult, state your commitment. Comment below, "I honor my voice," to own your strength and remind others that they are not alone in this journey. In the end, the solution isn't to stop being a loner, but to become a conscious one. When you integrate your shadow and assert your worth, you stop acting as a magnet for predators and start attracting only those who respect your depth. Protecting your energy is the most valuable currency you have. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, share it, and subscribe to Spiritual Wisdom. Be sure to turn on notifications so you never miss a lesson on your spiritual journey. Why the chosen ones walk alone. Loneliness does not come from having no people around, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to you. Carl Jung. Welcome back to Spiritual Wisdom. In today's video, Why the Chosen Ones Walk Alone, we explore the quiet, often misunderstood solitude that accompanies deep spiritual awakening, and how this sacred aloneness can become your greatest source of clarity, strength, and inner freedom. As you listen, reflect on your own journey. Have you ever felt set apart as you began to see life differently? Share your experience in the comments, and let's grow together through this wisdom. 1. Awakening creates natural solitude, not forced loneliness. When a person truly enters spiritual awakening, their way of seeing the world changes at a fundamental level, and this shift in perception naturally alters the way they relate to others. The illusions that once held meaning status, social roles, performative success, and collective expectations begin to dissolve, not because the awakened soul rejects society, but because they can no longer pretend that these structures define truth. This is where solitude begins, not as a punishment and not as a wound, but as a quiet side effect of clarity. The more deeply someone steps into spirituality, the harder it becomes to engage in surface-level connections that are built on appearances rather than awareness. Conversations that once felt normal may suddenly feel hollow, and shared interests may no longer resonate at the same frequency, creating a subtle emotional distance without conflict or rejection. This solitude is not rooted in isolation or social failure, but in incompatibility of perception. Once the illusion is seen through, it cannot be unseen. The awakened individual no longer seeks validation through belonging, nor do they chase acceptance at the cost of inner truth. Where others are bound together by shared illusions of what life is supposed to look like, the one who awakens sees beyond those scripts and can no longer perform within them without inner friction. They are not enchanted by titles, gossip, or the endless pursuit of things that inevitably fade, and this shift alone changes the texture of every relationship they touch. Even when they are surrounded by people, the sense of inner separation remains, not because love is absent, but because awareness is no longer shared. What makes this process especially paradoxical is that from the outside, nothing may appear wrong. Others may admire the awakened person, enjoy their company, or even feel inspired by them, yet true emotional synchronization becomes rare. Most human connection depends on shared unconscious patterns, and when those patterns dissolve in one person but remain active in others, the natural bridge between them weakens. This is why awakened solitude does not feel violent or dramatic. It feels quiet, gradual, and unavoidable. The chosen one does not walk alone because they wish to, but because their inner evolution has silently changed the terrain beneath their feet. As spirituality deepens, the nervous system itself begins to reject noise disguised as connection. The soul becomes sensitive to energetic truth, and anything misaligned begins to feel heavy rather than comforting. The desire to merge into crowds, trends, or emotional dependencies weakens, replaced by a growing need for stillness, meaning, and self-alignment. This is where many experience confusion, wondering why they feel distant even among familiar faces, why former relationships feel strained without visible conflict. Yet the distance is not created by ego. It is created by awareness. This natural solitude carries both grief and freedom. Grief arises from realizing that not everyone who once walked beside you can walk with you now. And freedom arises from no longer needing to distort yourself to remain understood. Carl Jung's insight becomes painfully relevant here, that people will do almost anything to avoid facing their own soul. And once you choose to face yours, the invisible wall between you and unconscious living becomes real. You may still love deeply, but your love becomes less possessive, less performative, and more grounded in truth. The awakening does not destroy connection. It changes the form of it. Over time, solitude becomes less of a loss and more of a recalibration. It becomes a space where the chosen one learns to stand without mirrors, to listen without external noise, and to exist without borrowed identity. What once felt like loneliness reveals itself as energetic independence, and what once felt like abandonment reshapes into self-alignment. The world may interpret this shift as detachment, but in reality, it is the nervous system stabilizing in truth rather than illusion. This is why awakening creates natural solitude, not forced loneliness, because separation is not an act of rejection. It is the quiet consequence of seeing clearly. 2. Most relationships are built on mutual illusions and needs. As your awareness deepens, you begin to see that many relationships are built not on truth, but on shared illusions and unmet needs. And once you recognize this, it becomes impossible to relate in the same unconscious way you once did. Friendships that once felt full may now feel thin, not because they suddenly changed, but because you changed, and your spirituality no longer allows you to bond over distraction, escapism, emotional dependence, or the need to simply pass time together. You stop clinging to people who once helped you avoid silence, because silence is no longer something you fear, and you stop seeking connection just to fill emotional gaps, because you have learned to meet yourself in those spaces first. And this shift alone can quietly separate you from circles where the bond was never rooted in truth to begin with. The more your spiritual development unfolds, the clearer it becomes that many attachments were never about love or understanding, but about soothing loneliness, avoiding inner work, or maintaining familiar roles. And once you see this, you can no longer pretend that surface connection is enough. You no longer feel drawn to conversations that revolve around gossip, status, or constant stimulation, because your nervous system is no longer addicted to noise, and your heart is no longer hungry for approval. People may still laugh with you, still admire you, still enjoy your presence, yet the invisible contract that once demanded you perform, agree, or shrink quietly falls away, and you stop betraying your inner truth just to remain included. You may notice that the more honest you become with yourself, the fewer people can truly meet you at that level. And what once felt like belonging now feels like emotional compromise. This is not because you are becoming distant or superior, but because your standards for connection have changed from need-based attachment to truth-based alignment. You no longer relate through wounds, shared emptiness, or emotional dependency, but through clarity, boundaries, and self-respect, and that kind of shift inevitably filters your relationships. What others may interpret as withdrawal is actually your refusal to participate in connections that require you to abandon yourself, and what the world may label as isolation is, in truth, a deeper return to inner wholeness. Walking alone, then, is not a punishment and not a rejection of others, but a natural result of no longer feeding on illusion. When you stop using relationships as emotional anesthesia, when you stop chasing companionship to avoid your own inner stillness, and when you stop needing others to validate your worth, something very fundamental changes in how you move through the world. Solitude no longer feels like lack, but like alignment, and aloneness no longer feels like exile, but like integrity. You still value connection, but now you value truth more, and you would rather stand alone in authenticity than belong in a bond that requires pretense. The deeper you go in spirituality, the more you understand that true connection cannot be built on illusion. And the quieter your life becomes on the surface, the more stable it grows from within. Are you ready to release the illusion and choose the truth? If so, comment below. I choose clarity to affirm your awakening and your courage to walk your true path. 3. The awakened one no longer seeks validation, status, or social games. The awakened one no longer seeks validation, status, or the approval of others, because they have already found something far more stable within themselves. And as that inner anchor strengthens, the hunger for gossip, drama, and social performance quietly fades away. What once seemed interesting now feels hollow, and what once felt necessary now feels exhausting. because the awakened mind no longer feeds on noise, but on truth. You stop performing to be accepted. You stop shaping yourself to fit into rooms that require you to shrink. And this alone creates a visible gap between you and those who still depend on roles, masks, and external praise to feel valuable, which is why your silence is often misunderstood as arrogance and your independence is mislabeled as coldness. When you no longer react to gossip, no longer compete for validation, and no longer perform emotional labor for social belonging, the familiar bonds that once surrounded you begin to loosen naturally, not through conflict, but through incompatibility of consciousness. You are no longer motivated by appearance, reputation, or social ranking, and that alone makes your presence feel strange in environments built on comparison and image. This shift is not about feeling superior to others, but about becoming unavailable to patterns that drain your energy and distort your identity. Because once awareness deepens, tolerance for emotional manipulation, performative friendships, and shallow attention evaporates. You begin to protect your time, your focus, and your inner equilibrium with quiet discipline rather than loud resistance. To those who still rely on constant social feedback to feel alive, your withdrawal can look like rejection, when in truth, it is discernment, and your distance can look like indifference, when in reality, it is self-respect. What many call loneliness is often just the natural silence that follows when false connections fall away. And while the world may see fewer names around you, inside there is more space, more clarity, and more stability than ever before. You are no longer pulled by the emotional gravity of crowds, and you are no longer shaped by the shifting opinions of others. This is why awakened people are often misunderstood, not because they reject others, but because they no longer seek to be reflected back to themselves through social mirrors. Walking alone is not a punishment, but a consequence of alignment. Because when you are no longer driven by validation, the system built on validation stops rewarding you. And that quiet independence can feel threatening to those who still depend on approval to feel whole. In this way, the path of the awakened becomes narrow, not through exclusion, but through clarity. And the solitude that follows is not empty, but precise, disciplined, and deeply rooted in self-awareness, shaped by spiritual wisdom and the timeless insights of Carl Jung. 4. Seeing through illusion naturally separates them from the collective dream. The moment a chosen one sees through illusion, a quiet separation unfolds, not because they withdraw from the world, but because the world they once belonged to can no longer hold their awakened perception. When the veil lifts, the collective dream that once dictated their choices and shaped their identity begins to lose its power, and what used to feel important approval, gossip, social rituals suddenly appears shallow and strangely distant. Small talk becomes hollow because it only touches the surface of life, while the chosen one now hears the deeper currents beneath it. Drama becomes meaningless because they recognize it as a cycle of unhealed fear, ego, and unconscious reaction. It is not that they judge others, but that their spiritual awakening allows them to see the emotional machinery behind people's behavior. And once something is understood, it loses the ability to control them. The old rules, unspoken expectations, collective habits, inherited values no longer grip them, because these rules were designed to keep people aligned with the dream, not aligned with truth. And as Carl Jung taught, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. The chosen one no longer calls it fate. They call it programming. And the moment programming is seen, it dissolves. This shift in perception naturally places them outside the crowd, even if they never intended to stand apart. Others may still smile at them, greet them politely, or admire them from afar. Yet deeper connection becomes rare, because genuine connection requires mutual presence, mutual honesty, and mutual awareness. Things that cannot exist when only one person has stepped out of the shared illusion. Without announcing it, without resisting anyone, without trying to be different, they simply stop participating in the unconscious agreements that bind most people together. They no longer chase validation because their sense of self is no longer built on external mirrors. They no longer follow social rhythms because they now feel the truth beneath them. They no longer fit into conversations built on distraction because their mind is tuned to a different frequency. In this quiet shift, this subtle withdrawal of energy and attention creates distance on its own, because the world continues spinning on illusion, while the chosen one begins walking in clarity. It is a strange transition, both liberating and isolating, because once the collective dream is seen through, it cannot be unseen. The chosen one becomes an outsider, not by rebellion, but by resonance, not by force, but by awakening, stepping into a level of spirituality where their inner vision grows sharper and their values transform. The friendships that were once sustained by shared confusion fade when the confusion disappears. The roles they once played lose meaning when they no longer need them. The noise they once tolerated becomes unbearable when silence begins to nourish them. And in this loneliness that grows from clarity, not rejection, they learn the first truth of the awakened path. You cannot walk with the crowd once you see what the crowd cannot see, and you cannot return to the dream once your eyes are open to the deeper reality beneath it. Don't forget to subscribe for more spiritual wisdom on seeing beyond illusions and awakening to your true path. 5. They understand others deeply, but do not force their truth on anyone. They understand others deeply, yet they never force their truth on anyone. The awakened one sees clearly why people cling to comfort, routines, and familiar beliefs. They recognize that these attachments are not born from ignorance alone, but from fear. Fear of uncertainty, fear of loss, fear of standing alone with one's own thoughts. Because of this understanding, they do not judge, criticize, or try to shake others awake by force. They know most people are not searching for truth itself, but for reassurance, stability, and something that feels safe enough to lean on. As Carl Jung expressed, people often resist truth, not because they cannot see it, but because it threatens the fragile structures they depend on to feel secure. This quiet awareness changes the way they relate to the world. They listen more than they speak. They observe rather than react. They offer compassion without demanding transformation. Yet this gentle stance slowly creates distance. Friends may not leave dramatically, but they drift one by one as conversations become shallow, values no longer align, and unspoken differences widen the space between hearts. The chosen one does not push anyone away, yet they no longer participate in illusions just to maintain a sense of belonging. Their spirituality expresses itself not through argument, but through restraint, patience, and inner clarity. As spiritual development deepens, Relationships that were once built on shared habits, excitement, or emotional dependency begin to feel empty. The chosen one can still care deeply, but they no longer need to be understood by everyone. They stop seeking validation for what they already know within themselves. Their presence changes, and people feel it even when nothing is said. They sense a stillness, a steadiness, a lack of reaction that unsettles those who live in constant emotional motion. This difference can no longer be hidden, and so connection becomes rare, not because love is absent, but because resonance is. Solitude slowly becomes a natural state rather than a punishment. It is no longer something imposed from the outside, but something accepted from within. The chosen one learns that truth does not require an audience. Growth does not require applause. Walking alone does not mean being lost. It means being unwilling to betray inner clarity for the comfort of constant company. They no longer try to wake others because they understand that awakening cannot be given, it must be chosen. And so they walk quietly forward, carrying both deep compassion and firm boundaries, allowing each soul to unfold in its own time, even when that means continuing the journey without familiar faces beside them. Declare your independence of spirit by commenting below, "I honor my truth," and let that quiet strength guide your path. Share this message with someone who may need the freedom to walk their own way, because truth grows when it's released with love. 6. Their lack of need for validation unsettles others. Validation is the invisible glue that quietly holds many relationships together, even when people are not aware of it. And the moment you no longer seek it in the familiar ways, the emotional structure of those connections begins to shift. When you stop needing approval, reassurance, constant praise, or permission to be who you are, others often feel subtly unsettled in your presence. It is not because you have become distant or unkind, but because your independence removes the reflection they once depended on to feel secure. Many people rely on validation as emotional stability, and when you no longer participate in that silent exchange, it exposes a fragile dependence they may not be ready to face. As Carl Jung observed, people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul. And your calm self-assurance gently but unmistakably invites them to do exactly that. When you no longer seek validation, you also stop offering it automatically in the ways people expect. You stop reinforcing fragile identities, stop mirroring insecurity, and stop participating in the subtle emotional bargaining that keeps many connections alive. Without intending to, your presence begins to feel confronting to those who still depend on external affirmation for their sense of worth. They may feel judged, even when no judgment exists, simply because your inner stability highlights their inner uncertainty. This is why people sometimes grow distant without explanation, why warmth fades without conflict, and why relationships that once felt natural suddenly require effort just to sustain. You did not withdraw your frequency, and not everyone can remain comfortable within it. In the space where validation once flowed, silence often appears, and silence can feel threatening to those who are not anchored within themselves. When you no longer react with need, comparison, or emotional dependence, others may interpret your stillness as rejection, coldness, or superiority, even though it is simply alignment. Spiritual wisdom teaches that self-worth must be rooted internally, or it will always be fragile. And when you live from that truth, you quietly expose how many connections are built on emotional hunger rather than genuine presence. You no longer seek to be chosen, approved, or admired, and this unsettles those who still measure their value through attention, recognition, and belonging. As you step more deeply into this inner independence, familiar dynamics begin to dissolve. Conversations that once revolved around reassurance, comparison, or shared insecurity lose their emotional fuel. You may notice that people who once felt close now feel distant, not because love vanished, but because the foundation of mutual validation has vanished. This is not abandonment, it is an energetic realignment. Carl Jung once said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." And when you live that privilege fully, you unknowingly remove the emotional scaffolding that others relied on to feel whole. 7. They no longer fit into society's unspoken rules and emotional contracts. They no longer fit into society's unspoken rules and emotional contracts because once a person begins to see clearly through the lens of spirituality and spiritual awakening, they naturally stop participating in the silent agreements that keep most relationships intact. These are the quiet, invisible exchanges where people protect each other's illusions, reinforce each other's fears, and stabilize fragile egos so that everyone can continue feeling safe inside familiar roles and narratives. The moment someone steps outside of this emotional choreography, everything begins to shift, not loudly, not dramatically, but unmistakably. Their very presence becomes disruptive, not through argument or rebellion, but through authenticity. As Carl Jung said, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. And when someone begins to live from that truth, they no longer serve as a silent collaborator in collective pretense. Invitations fade gradually, conversations lose depth, and once warm interactions become distant because people sense often, without fully understanding why the old emotional exchange has been broken, that the unspoken agreement to maintain appearances is no longer being honored. When a person no longer participates in gossip, no longer trades validation as emotional currency, and no longer hides discomfort behind polite performance, the invisible structure that once supported the relationship weakens. What once felt effortless now feels strained, not because of conflict, but because the connection was never built on truth. The awakened presence acts like a mirror, reflecting unresolved fears and hidden contradictions back to others. And for those who are still attached to their narratives, this reflection feels unsettling rather than liberating. People do not always withdraw out of rejection. More often, they retreat out of discomfort. The distance grows quietly, without confrontation, because remaining close would require them to question parts of themselves they are not yet ready to face. And so, the relationship dissolves naturally, not as a tragedy, but as a consequence of two inner worlds no longer operating on the same frequency. As the emotional contracts based on self-abandonment dissolve, it becomes clear that many connections only survived as long as one person keeps shrinking, performing, or betraying their inner truth to maintain harmony. Once that suppression ends, the external harmony cannot survive either. What falls away is not real intimacy, but the illusion of it, revealing how fragile those bonds always were. Walking alone, then, is not a deliberate choice toward isolation, but a natural outcome of no longer feeding emotional systems built on avoidance, fear, and dependency. What remains may feel unfamiliar at first, yet beneath the quiet, there is a growing sense of inner alignment. The distance carries not only loss, but also freedom. The freedom of no longer belonging to a world held together by silent agreements that required unconsciousness to survive. 8. Walking alone becomes a peaceful, chosen way of being. Walking alone becomes a peaceful and chosen way of being when you finally outgrow the world's illusions and recognize that solitude is not emptiness, but clarity. As a chosen one, you do not withdraw out of resentment or disappointment. You step back because you no longer feel the need to belong to a reality built on shallow expectations, roles, and masks that never fit your spirit. You begin to see that most people cling to each other not out of genuine understanding, but out of fear. Fear of being alone. Fear of facing themselves. Fear of breaking the collective illusion that keeps them distracted. Yet when your spirituality deepens and your spiritual development expands, you can no longer participate in relationships that demand you to shrink, pretend, or stay asleep to your own truth. This shift pulls you inward toward a quieter life where inner peace becomes more valuable than fitting in, and where authenticity becomes more important than approval. As you move through this inner transformation, solitude turns into a sanctuary where your thoughts clear, your emotions adjust, and your soul finally has the space to breathe. You stop chasing validation because you understand that anything born from insecurity will eventually collapse, and anything sustained by illusion will bring suffering. Instead, you learn to trust the natural rhythm of your path, knowing that the right connections, those built on awareness and honesty rather than need, will find their way into your life without force. In this state, you no longer worry about appearing distant or different, because you realize that the world often misunderstands those who see deeply, and depth has always walked a quieter road. Solitude teaches you to listen to yourself, to honor your intuition, and to protect your energy with intention rather than guilt. Gradually, you recognize that walking alone is not a sign of isolation, but a sign of strength, because it means you refuse to settle for relationships that drain your spirit or distract you from your purpose. You begin to value the rare souls who meet you with presence, humility, and truth. Those who do not fear your intensity, your depth, or your clarity. These connections arrive naturally and effortlessly because they are not built on illusion, but on mutual recognition. And when such people cross your path, you feel a quiet certainty rather than desperation, a calm knowing rather than a need to grasp. In this way, walking alone becomes a powerful filter that removes everything false from your life and makes space only for what is real. If this message resonates with your soul, leave a comment below. I choose peace in my own path. Let your words affirm the quiet strength of walking alone. In the end, the reason the chosen ones walk alone is not because they are rejected by the world, but because they have outgrown the illusions that bind it, much like Carl Jung taught. True individuation demands inner courage, solitude, and unwavering self-honesty. This solitary path is not a punishment, but a sacred initiation into higher awareness, deeper purpose, and authentic spiritual wisdom. If this message resonated with your journey, support spiritual wisdom by liking this video, sharing it with someone who may need it, and subscribing to our channel. Be sure to turn on the notification bell so you never miss our upcoming videos on awakening, psychology, and the hidden truths of the soul.